Hello, and welcome to PetroLMI's webinar on our Rotational Workforce Report. We'll be sharing highlights from Rotating, Not Relocating, Alberta's Oil and Gas Rotational Workforce, which we released in June. If you're interested in downloading the full report and accompanying fact sheet, please visit careersinoilandgas.com/reports. My name is Kaylee Rind, and I'm a Communications Advisor here with ENFORM. For today, I'm also your facilitator for this webinar. I'd like to start by introducing our presenters. Our first presenter is Carol Howes, Vice President of Communications in PetroLMI. Carol joined us in early February of this year and is responsible for providing overall leadership to the division. She also looks forward to bringing focus to PetroLMI's mandate through 2015 and into 2016. Carol will share a little more about that with you shortly. Our second presenter is Emma Monahan. Emma joined PetroLMI in March of 2014 as a labor market analyst and recently transitioned into the role of Interim Project Manager for the Labor Market Information Team. As Interim Project Manager, Emma leads and coordinates research activities for PetroLMI's Labor Market Information initiatives.
Thanks, Kaylee. Before we begin, I'd just like to go over the agenda for this webinar. Firstly, I'll give you a quick overview of PetroLMI and ENFORM and what we do. After that, we'll present the purpose and methodology of the research, and then we'll get into the meat of the report. So let's start with a summary of who it is we are and what we do, especially for those of you who aren't that familiar with our name or our division. We used to be the Petroleum Human Resources Council. In 2013, we were acquired by ENFORM, which is a safety association for the petroleum industry. As part of that integration, we changed our name to PetroLMI, Petroleum Labor Market Information, because it better reflects what it is we really do. Our mandate is to collaborate with many of you in industry, government, educators, and training agencies in order that we can help support and advance the development of a sustainable, skilled, and productive workforce in the upstream and increasingly the midstream sectors. So what is it we do? We generate labor market information and resources. That includes labor market outlooks, and we use a proprietary labor market modeling system that provides analysis and insight on our industry's longer-term employment requirements, hiring projections, and labor supply. Our key model inputs are economic data and industry activity forecasts. We also produce reports we call HR Trends and Insights. These reports, like the one you're going to hear more about today, focus on current or short-term labor market conditions and HR trends, things like changing workforce demographics, potential supply pools, in-demand jobs, and industry practices for such things as attracting and retaining workers. You may have seen the employment impact assessment we put out a few months ago, which provided some insight into the number of direct and indirect jobs that will be impacted by this year's severe decline in oil prices. One other area that we are really currently doing a lot of work on is career profiles. We develop profiles of current and future occupations in the industry that include the working environment, educational, as well as skills and training requirements. We're in the process of developing a tool that we believe will be unique to the industry and that will help to map careers, measure the transferability of skills and qualifications from one job to another, and in and out of other industries. This study now that we're going to tell you a little bit more about was funded by the Government of Alberta and the Government of Canada's Sectoral Initiatives Program. This was designed to get a better understanding of the rotational worker, camp life, the impact on communities, and why this sector of the workforce has grown so substantially within the oil and gas industry. There is minimal statistical available out there on this workforce in Alberta, or elsewhere for that matter. This report combines what data there is with primary research and additional qualitative data to provide as much of a picture as possible for you. In terms of our methodology, primary sources included a number of interviews with those in industry, government, camp providers, and workers. Our researchers also spent some time at a company-owned oil sands construction camp, as well as an open lodge, where direct interaction with the camp providers and the workers provided a deeper understanding of camp life and camp culture. We also surveyed members of MARS, the Manufacturers Association of Relocatable Structures, on their camps, as well as a number of oil sands companies as part of a headcount survey. Our secondary sources of information came from a considerable review of a variety of domestic and international literature. For the purposes of this research, we define rotational work as work arrangements that allows workers to have a set number of days on a given work site, those who return home at the end of their work schedule for a set number of days or time off. It's important to note that the workers we are referring to here are those who fly in, fly out, drive in or drive out, bus in or bus out, and live and work camps during their rotations. While this research focuses on oil and gas companies, we acknowledge the critical role that construction and maintenance functions play in the industry. And for this reason, some of the references that are made in the report are made to that broader rotational workforce. So let's move to the next slide to begin discussing the importance of a rotational workforce. As I'm sure we'd all agree, the rotational workforce has become increasingly important in Alberta's oil and gas industry in recent years, particularly with the development of remote in situ and thermal oil sands projects. These rotational work arrangements have become a necessity so companies can respond to changing labor and skill requirements through project life cycles. A rotational workforce allows a company to gain access to a diverse and skilled workforce, especially because these operational sites are usually so far away from the labor and the skills that they require. It also allows for flexibility. It provides industry with a workforce that is able to adapt to varying workloads and locations. With many oil and gas operations running 24/7, rotational workers ensure that there is a full crew on site at all times. I'll now turn it over to Emma to present the findings of the research.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks again to everyone for your interest in our webinar and our research. The next section looks at some of the data we uncovered during the course of the research. It's fair to say that we did encounter some hiccups with finding reliable current data. There's lots of data out there, but none comprehensively cover the scope of this research, and you're probably wondering why this might be the case. In general, there's a lack of standardizing reporting practices. The mix of permanent employees and contractors, together with makeshift rotators, that is, those rotators who are not officially supported by their company, makes it difficult to accurately estimate the number of rotational workers in these types of operations. Companies typically track only their own permanent employees and those who they officially provide rotational support to. Camp operators don't report or share occupancy rates for the camps they own, probably because of competitive reasons. Additionally, operations requirements and the associated workforce are fluid, so any point-in-time measurement becomes dated very quickly. One of the best available sources of data on Alberta's rotational workforce is a 2004 to 2008 study of interprovincial workers that was completed using tax filer information. When we talk about interprovincial workers, we mean those workers who maintain a permanent residence in a given province or territory while working in a different province or territory. So, what are the limitations of this tax filer data? Well, it is a little bit outdated, and it uses tax filer information from 2004 to 2008, although we have heard that this is being updated later this year. It doesn't identify Albertans who travels from their primary residence to another location in Alberta. It doesn't include self-employed workers, and it does not allow for any specific analysis to the oil and gas industry. Putting these limitations aside, let's look at this data and some of the trends we can infer. On this slide, we can see from the chart that in 2004, approximately 67,500 workers from outside of Alberta had paid employment in the province, making up almost 4% of Alberta's employee base. By 2008, that number had increased to about 133,000 and made up just over 6% of the province's workforce, which is an increase of almost 100%. Although the number of interprovincial employees in Alberta declined when the industry downturn occurred in 2008-09, the number never did return to pre-2005 levels, so we may be able to expect a similar trend this time around. Looking at Alberta's interprovincial workforce by industry, we can see that the percentage of interprovincial employees in Alberta's oil and gas extraction and support service is consistently higher than the amount of interprovincial workers in Alberta's total workforce. But we can also see from this slide that not all rotational workers in oil and gas, and that the industry with the highest percentage of rotational workers since 2008 is actually construction. So then, when you think of Alberta's rotational workers, do you think they are mostly young and single? Well, on this slide, we can see some demographic shifts occurring in the years 2004 to 9, and Alberta's interprovincial workers are actually older and either married or in common law relationships. In fact, the largest percentage of respondents were between 50 and 54 years of age. This shift in the demographic profile of workers living in project accommodations was also reflected in the Royal Municipality of Wood Buffalo census, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. In the report, we have a special spread on the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo, the heart of the oil sands. This region is one that has made significant progress in quantifying the number of rotational workers in camps in the area. As we can see on this slide, 1,800 workers were surveyed in the 2012 municipal census, and that between 2012 and 2014, the number of accommodations rose by 39% in 2 years. Driving the need for these camps is the rapid development of the oil sands sector and the associated increase of workers. We can see from this slide that there were more than 39,000 rotational workers in Wood Buffalo in 2012, and in 2014 this number rose to nearly 47,000, and this number was recorded in June, which is low season and likely to be conservative. Slide 17 shows some demographics for Wood Buffalo. Not shown on this slide is the fact that the largest percentage of workers came from BC at 25%. Less than 9% of the workers were from Saskatchewan. 16% came from Newfoundland. Almost 16% were from New Brunswick, and the final 12% were from Nova Scotia. Switching topics slightly, we now move on to giving a general overview of work rotations, transportation, in camps. Providing worker choice leads to improved worker attraction, retention, and productivity. As we can see, there are multiple scheduling options, which makes this type of rotational work more attractive. I should just point out that when we say 7 on 7, this means that workers work for 7 days straight and then take 7 days off. Through the research, we found that equal work versus time off rotations are more conducive to ensuring optimal downtime. Next, we'll take a look at transportation. There are a few different ways that workers can get from their residential home to their work site. They can fly in and fly out, drive in or drive out, or even bus in or bus out. Generally, companies provide transportation arrangements to get workers from pickup hubs to their operations site, and the benefits of this are clear. It gives the ability to attract workers from broader geographic regions, and it reduces road traffic and leads to increased safety in operational areas. In fact, oil sands operators in the Fort McMurray area have been commended for not allowing personal vehicles on work sites, as it reduces fatigue and congestion-related traffic incidents. We'll talk more about safety on a later slide. Now let's move on to the camps themselves. There are two main types of camps, owner or company camps and open lodges. As you can see from the pictures, they do look similar, but they actually operate differently. In a nutshell, owner or company camps are more long-term and permanent and are more self-contained, which means fewer community services are needed. Open lodges owned by camp companies are more temporary and more likely to rely on resources and contracted services from the local community. We'll talk more about community impacts later as well. A closed camp means that rooms and facilities are only available to the owner company. Slide 22 shows some differences between open and closed camps, such as their policies on alcohol. Open camps tend to be dry, whereas closed camps can be wet or dry. Private rooms are standard in closed camps, but Jack and Jill dorms may be present in open camps. One key point that we'd like to highlight is the fact that Alberta's camps have been described as world-class. Alberta's industry and regulators have progressively evolved the rotational workforce in camp life by minimizing community and environmental impact and maximizing worker quality of life through implementing best practices in safety, scheduling, and accommodations, and these are now integral to the workplace culture. On this slide, we can see that camps operate as communities of their own, and they provide activities after work to encourage this sense of community. Now we move on to discuss business drivers for the rotational workforce. So what is it that propels the need for such a workforce? Well, it is important to reiterate the industry and economic need. These rotational workers have become a vital and permanent component of Alberta's oil and gas industry workforce for a number of reasons, including the fact that remote locations of operations means that the closest communities cannot always supply the required skilled workers. Additionally, as mentioned, there is a safety concern. Ensuring workers are not making long commutes after 12-hour shift is very important. Then there is the business need. Rotational work is not a temporary business choice, but rather a permanent business requirement that allows for stability through flexibility. It provides a flexible workforce that can nimbly expand and contract with the rise and fall of oil and gas prices and changes in the needs of project location, size, and skill requirements. On the notion of safety, we do have a few facts for you on this slide. Maintaining worker safety is a key driver for camps. The focus on safety is stricter compared to sites where workers go home at the end of the day. After-work activities enhance the emotional health of workers. Workers reported that working and living alongside co-workers leads to a culture of taking care of one another. Equal work versus time off rotations ensure appropriate worker downtime, and in fact it is the irregularity of rotations or shifts that have a more negative impact on worker performance and safety than either the length and rotation of shift, as the worker's system or circadian rhythm doesn't have the opportunity to adjust appropriately if the shifts are irregular. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of rotational work and what to consider when making this lifestyle choice. The research found that workers who have a realistic perspective of the benefits and challenges associated with rotational work are most successful and able to optimize the financial, social, and lifestyle impacts. It's interesting to note that while a number of factors determine whether rotational work is a fit for different individuals, many workers actively choose and prefer the camp and rotational work lifestyle for reasons like increased salaries, lifestyle advantages for family, more vacation, and premium accommodation. Dual career families may prefer rotating rather than relocating, as it means one spouse doesn't have to interrupt or change their work situation to accommodate another. But the rotational lifestyle is not for everybody. Some of the main reasons why workers leave are outlined on this slide and include accepting rotational work solely for financial reasons and experiencing lifestyle changes, such as getting married or having children. As highlighted on the slide, when we surveyed 12 oil sands companies recently, turnover rates for rotational workers were actually the same or lower than non-rotational staff. Now let's turn it back over to Carol to close out the presentation.
Thanks, Emma. I'd like to spend a little time talking about the social economic impacts of rotational work arrangements on communities. What was interesting to find when doing this research was that companies, camp operators, and community representatives did not necessarily share the same views on the impacts of rotational work arrangements. while company representatives felt that they had little to no negative impacts on such things as local community infrastructure and services, the communities themselves seemed to think otherwise. We'll share more of that in a moment, but before we do, I wanted to share with you some of the findings with regards to planning for a rotational workforce and the construction of camps. Not surprisingly, one of the first considerations is cost, and that's particularly true in the current environment. The type of business model directly affects the cost incurred by a camp provider, whether it is an open lodge or a company-owned camp. With the temporary nature of the open lodges, costs are typically passed on to the clients. The standards of food, facilities, and services that are provided are largely driven by the needs of the clients. Typically, accommodation costs between $150 and $265 a day for a private room, and that includes high-quality food and entertainment and recreational facilities. Company-owned camps, on the other hand, tend to be more permanent structures, and then return on investment is distributed over a larger period of time. Though the direct cost of accommodation is often lower, the costs associated with development and startup tend to be higher because of the quality and standards that are required to support a long-term operation. The next slide provides some findings from the survey of MARS members on factors that drive the costs associated with building and operating a camp. Survey respondents indicated that building and setup costs, labor, transportation, and site services, internet, landlines, were the major costs associated with building a camp. Factors such as labor, site services, infrastructure or maintenance, such as fuel, water, sewage haul, garbage removal, and last but not least, consumables like food and beverages, were the costs associated with operating a camp. As I mentioned earlier, there were differing views on the socioeconomic impacts on communities. This table outlines some of the points that are both positive and negative socioeconomic impacts outlined in this study. In sum, in terms of impacts, the costs and the scrutiny from communities and regulators could influence camp provider practices going forward. As many of you know, obtaining a social license to operate is key to any oil and gas industry project. Companies reported a variety of ways that they are giving back to local communities. A couple of examples: TransCanada developed the Wandering River Breakfast Program prior to establishing a camp south of Fort McMurray to provide children of the Wandering River School with breakfast. Other things they're doing: camp operators are offering training for camp positions and job opportunities as a way of supporting local communities. This is particularly helping Aboriginals who get jobs while still maintaining their social and cultural environments. The Blue Quills First Nations College is one example of that. It teaches Aboriginals about employment readiness for life in a camp, and it helps them prepare for work in food services, housekeeping, and administrative roles. So what's next? Our research found one of the biggest challenges to developing further sustainable practices around rotational work and community development is a lack of data. It makes it difficult to accurately measure the impacts of rotational work and camps on communities and the environment. With that, it would be beneficial for further research if it was undertaken in order to determine how to minimize community and environmental impacts, as well as maximize worker quality of life, not to mention getting a better handle on the demographics. Regular reporting that compares place of work to place of residence would go a long way in accomplishing that. So just to summarize then, practices associated with rotational workers in Alberta's oil and gas industry are driven by the industry's need and worker choice. A rotational workforce allows companies to respond to changing labor requirements and is necessary for projects to be viable in this industry. Providing choice to workers is critical for the industry to attract and retain a mobile and skilled workforce from across the country. Workforce mobility and rotational work will continue to be a significant factor in Alberta and Canada's economic well-being. Despite the limitations of the available data for this study, it's worth reiterating Emma's comment earlier that this research did find that the oil and gas industry and its regulators have over the years progressively evolved rotational work arrangements and camp life for the better in Alberta, and it continues to do so.
Thank you, Carol and Emma. If you have any questions or comments about today's webinar, or you're interested to learn more about our labour market information products and key findings, you can email Emma at emma.monahan@enform.ca. Thank you again for participating in the webinar. As a reminder, PetroLMI's products can be downloaded by visiting www.careersinoilandgas.com. We'll be hosting the webinar on our SlideShare site, slideshare.net/PetroLMI. Also be sure to check out ENFORM at enform.ca for more information on ENFORM safety and training courses. Finally, you can connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.